let it go.
Few segments of a flight is considered as critical as the takeoff. That's why we pilots are always primed to be 100% alert during that phase, but that doesn't mean that bad mistakes never happens.
V1. Rotate.
Stay tuned. You know how you sometimes hear about mistakes that sound almost comical? That's the ones that you just kind of shake your head when you hear about them and you think, how on earth could that have ever happened? Well, if there is one thing that I've learned from reading hundreds of accident and incident reports, it is that even the most silly-looking mistakes often stem from very real underlying threats. And that there is almost always something that can be learned from even the strangest of occurrences. This, by the way, is also why I never assumed that I myself wouldn't make those very same mistakes given the wrong circumstances, and that's worth remembering. On the 1st of December 2021, a crew from Jet2 were getting ready to operate a charter flight from London Stansted Airport in the United Kingdom over to Kuusamo Airport in Finland, and then back again. The two pilots had both been on off-duty the day before, but given that it was December, they had both still checked the weather and realized that it would likely be snowing in Kuusamo during their coming flight. This meant that they would face winter ops conditions, so they had taken some time off from their free time to read up on their winter ops procedures and properly prepare. Now, if you think that it sounds strange that pilots would take some time away from their families in order to read through manuals, it actually isn't. I remember clearly doing the same when I was based in London Stansted, and it has to do with the fact that even during the winter months, you don't actually get exposed to real winter operations that often. And the problem is that winter ops is much more complicated than normal operations, full of potential threats that, if you aren't properly prepared, can really jump up and bite you. In any case, at around 09:15 local time, the two pilots had arrived to the crew room and were looking through their pre-flight briefing material. From that, they could see that the weather in Stansted, as well as along the route, was supposed to be reasonably good, but also that the weather in Kuusamo was, just as expected, quite wintry. The forecast showed a light wind from the northeast, together with light snowfall, reducing the visibility to around 8 kilometers and a temperature of -8 degrees Celsius. So, cold and Scandinavian, but not particularly bad. As the pilots then looked through the NOTAMs, there was nothing of real interest there, except that Kuusamo Airport would change from using air traffic control service over to a flight information service at around the time that they were scheduled to arrive. Now, that normally doesn't make much of a difference. It would just mean that the aircraft likely would have to operate out of uncontrolled airspace during the departure later on, but as it turns out, this would have some significance in this case. Anyway, the pilots soon completed their paperwork, ordered the fuel that they needed, and then walked over to their 4 cabin crew colleagues to brief them about the flight. It was going to be a little bit unusual, since the first flight over to Finland was a charter flight, meaning that there would be no passengers for the return leg. But this was something that this crew was probably quite used to. Charter flights are operated in an almost identical way as normal scheduled flights are, but they're normally hired by a travel agency or some other entity and therefore might have different catering and scheduling. Anyway, just before 10 o'clock local time, the crew walked out together to their aircraft that was being prepared for them out on the ramp. It was a beautiful 5-year-old Boeing 737-800 with 2 CFM56 engines hanging under its sleek wings. And according to the final report, it was also in a very good working order. Now, the captain was 44 years old and had a total experience of just over 7,450 hours, of which 3,344 had been flown on this particular type. His first officer was 41 years old and had 4,582 hours, making him quite experienced in general, with just under 2,400 hours on the 737. As they were walking out together, they discussed who was going to fly which leg, and they decided that the captain would be pilot flying on the first flight and that the first officer would therefore bring them back home again. So as the cabin crew completed their pre-flight checks and started greeting the passengers, the first officer completed the walk around whilst the captain set up the cockpit for departure, just like they would have done hundreds of times before. Once everything was done, the aircraft pushed back, started its engines, and at around time 10:15 local time, it departed normally from Stansted and started tracking up towards Kuusamo. Now, during the cruise phase, the pilots had some more time to discuss the winter ops procedures that they had in front of them, and those discussions likely included things like the de- and anti-icing procedure, but also several other variations to the normal procedures. You see, when operating into snowy and icy destinations, almost every part of our operation is affected in one way or another. For landing, we have to find out what state the runway is in, if it has any deposits on it like snow or slush, and from that information we can use something known as a talpa matrix to figure out how efficient our brakes will be in slowing us down. And this is obviously very important for our landing distance calculations. But we also need to know if there is slush present on the runways and taxiways, as that can be thrown up from our wheels and reverses and deposit itself inside of the flap mechanisms. If that turns out to be the case, well then we will have to wait with retracting the flaps after landing, and only do that after a proper inspection has been done at the stand in order to avoid damaging our flaps. We will then also, during the walk-around, decide on what type of de- or anti-icing we will need, depending on how the aircraft looks, as well as if it's snowing, what temperature it is outside, and what the temperature is inside of the fuel tanks, which is normally a lot lower than it is outside. On top of that, we then also have to make sure that those de- and anti-icing procedures are properly executed, often after all of the passengers have been boarded. You see, in most cases, we want the anti-icing procedures to start as late as possible, since the fluids that we use are only effective a certain time after application. Again, depending on how much it is snowing, how cold it is outside, and how cold it is in the fuel tanks. As you can see, there are a lot to keep in mind here, and I've only mentioned a few things. There is actually a lot more, and that's even before starting to mention the pre-departure procedures. But I'll get to that soon. As the aircraft was getting closer to the destination, the pilots took the latest weather and saw that it remained unchanged from their briefing material. There was a slight crosswind from the right for runway 30. The temperature was -8 degrees Celsius with a continuous light snowfall, causing a visibility between 6 and 8 kilometers. The airport also reported that the runway condition code was 4. That's on a scale from 1 to 6, and a 4 means braking action medium to good. Not terribly slippery, but worse than a normal wet runway. The pilots used this to complete their landing calculations and saw that there was going to be no problem to land. So the captain continued by briefing a standard ILS approach for runway 30, and about 30 minutes later, the aircraft landed normally and taxied into its stand via taxiway Alpha. Now, Kuusamo airport is quite small, so the aircraft used a self-positioning stand, meaning that no pushback would be needed later on for departure. And once the aircraft had come to a complete stop and the engines were shut down, all of the passengers were disembarked and the crew started preparing the aircraft for the return flight to Stansted. And here is where things start getting really interesting. But before we get to that, there's this. Incidents like the one I'm about to explain to you shows us just how quickly the ordinary can spiral into chaos, and therefore how important it is to have working mitigation strategies available when that happens. But that isn't limited to only emergencies in aviation. You also have to apply that principle in your everyday life, which is where protecting your cybersecurity and data is becoming super important. And that's why I'm so proud to present Incogni as the sponsor of this video, since they are a powerful tool in doing just that. Every day, your data, like phone numbers, email addresses, and even information about your friends and family, is legally being bought and sold on the internet by shady entities known as data brokers. Now, once your data has been entered into this marketplace, it's super annoying and time-consuming to get it back, since you have to contact each one of these entities individually, and there are hundreds of them. And that's likely why you're getting so much spam nowadays. But here is where Incogni comes in with their powerful digital army. When you sign up, Incogni will start doing all of this work for you by finding out who is selling your data and then telling them to immediately cease and desist. They will then continue to monitor compliance and scan for new actors for as long as you stay with them. When I signed up, I was shocked to see just how widespread my data was. Well over 100 brokers were selling it, and that has now dropped significantly, which means a lot less spam and robocalls for me. So if you want to do the same and start protecting your data today, go to incogni.com/pilot. That will give you an awesome 60% discount on their annual plan and will also help support my channel. Thank you, Incogni. Now, let's continue the story. As the passengers kept disembarking, the pilots had already started preparing for the return flight back towards London. Like I mentioned before, this would be done with an empty aircraft except for the crew, which meant that the takeoff weight would be very low. During the previous approach, they had only had some light headwind and mostly crosswind from the right, and since the only taxiway was situated almost at the very end of the runway they had arrived from, the pilots decided that it would be much better to take off from the opposite runway, since that would reduce the taxi distance a lot. Now, there was likely also another good reason for doing that. Like I mentioned before, it was still snowing outside, so the crew would have to de- and anti-ice the aircraft. And since the time that liquid is effective, what's known as the holdover time, is limited, it's also a good idea to limit the taxi time in order to stay within that window. In this case though, since the snowfall was very light, it probably had more to do with expedience than anything else. In any case, when preparing for a departure during freezing conditions, there are again several things that we need to take into account. I've already mentioned the de- and anti-icing, but on top of that, we also have to calculate the takeoff performance based on a slippery runway. And when calculating any departure, we always have to consider 3 different scenarios, which is true for winter ops as well, it's just a little bit more complicated. In the first scenario, we have to make sure that the aircraft have enough runway to accelerate using all available engines and get normally airborne, reaching 35 feet over the runway end plus a 15% safety margin. In the second scenario, we have to accelerate all the way up to the decision speed of V1, suffer an engine failure there, and make sure that we are still able to continue the takeoff, rotate and reach a safe climb speed of V2 and 35 feet by the end of the runway. And in the last scenario, we have to be able to do the same, but instead of continuing for a takeoff, we would wait 2 seconds after reaching V1 and then decide to reject the takeoff, and then safely come to a stop within the available runway. All of these 3 scenarios are calculated, and the longest distance of these is the shortest distance that we can accept. Does that make sense? Well, basically, this means that we will make sure that we always have enough distance for all of these scenarios to happen, and which of them will end up being the most limiting will vary depending on, for example, how slippery the runway is. Since that will obviously affect the braking distance in the last scenario, but snow or slush on the runway might also affect the acceleration, making the first 2 scenarios longer. So like I said, it's complicated. Luckily though, today, most airlines, including Jet2, offer their pilots electronic flight bags containing software programmed to help us calculate these distances. And what becomes really important then is to make sure that we actually input the correct values, which is why all calculations normally are done separately by each pilot and then cross-checked. Once that's completed, we then obviously also have to be vigilant about any changes in those parameters that we used, as an increase in snowfall could both affect the holdover time and the runway conditions that we've used for our performance. Now, apart from all of that, most procedures and setup stays more or less the same, except there tends to be a few extra steps involved. After we have started the engines, for example, and before we start to taxi the aircraft, the flaps would normally be selected to the takeoff position. But during winter ops, we tend to instead delay selecting the flaps until we reach the holding point, just before departure. And we do that because the flaps are normally retracted at the gate when the rest of the wing is being anti-iced and are therefore not protected by any anti-icing fluid. Now, the fact that the flaps are not extended where we would normally do it is of course a big threat, because forgetting to set the flaps for takeoff could be potentially very, very dangerous. So generally, airlines tend to provide their crews with completely different winter ops checklists and procedures, which has to be followed very, very closely. Now, as you can hear, this can be quite a lot to keep track of, and everything is super important to get right, which again was probably why the pilots of this flight had been refreshing all of this at home on the day before. I always tell my students that whilst operating in winter ops, everything tells you to hurry up. Holdover times, slots, traffic and schedule, but you need to do the absolute opposite and slow down, because there are so many ways to make mistakes here. Now that's actually a good rule to follow in any complicated situation, even outside of flying. It's often better to slow down in order to hurry up. Anyway, the performance calculation that these pilots made will become very important soon, so let's have a look at it. As I mentioned before, the pilots decided to use the opposite, runway 12 for departure, and also to base their calculation on a start of the takeoff roll from taxiway Alpha. That way, they could just enter the runway at a straight angle and begin the takeoff from there without having to backtrack. With 9,600 kilos of fuel needed for the return flight, their takeoff weight was calculated to be 52,100 kilos, which is a good 15 to 20 tons lighter than normal since there were no passengers on board. The latest weather was reported as still minus 8 degrees Celsius with a wind from 040 degrees at 5 knots, visibility of 6 kilometers in light snow and an air pressure of 983 hectopascals. And this snowfall had in turn led to the runway being covered by 3 millimeters of light snow and a runway braking action of 4, again meaning medium to good. When the pilots punched this into their computers, the calculation showed a minimum thrust setting N1 of 89% and the takeoff speeds to be used as V1 93 knots, a rotation speed of 122 knots and the safe single-engine climb speed V2 of 131, all of which with flaps 5 used as the takeoff setting. Now, those of you paying attention would see that the V1 was unusually low in this case, and that's because of the slightly slippery runway condition, which required an earlier rejected takeoff in case of an engine failure, obviously combined with a very low takeoff weight. Now, if you are really into aerodynamics, you should know that there is also another speed that needs to be taken into account here, something known as VMCG, which is the minimum control speed on the ground. VMCG is the minimum speed required for maintaining directional control using aerodynamic surfaces like the rudder only in case of an engine failure with the remaining engine producing takeoff thrust. As you can imagine, that speed needs to be quite high in order for the rudder to be able to counteract the huge asymmetric thrust in that scenario. And obviously, the V1 can never be lower than that speed, since the aircraft would then potentially lose directional control when continuing to accelerate for takeoff after an engine failure. Now, in my experience, the VMCG here must have been very close to the 93 knots that they had set. I've actually seen it as high as around 105 knots and even higher than that. But then again, this aircraft was, like I said, very, very light. Anyway, that was a bit of a sidestep. Sorry. Once the pilots had confirmed that their calculations were correct and loaded this into the flight management computer, the first officer continued by briefing for the departure. They also asked for the departure clearance at this point and were told to, after departure, climb to flight level 400 via a point called Ibevu, which was situated to the southwest of the airport, and that meant that they could expect a right turn after departure. Now, before I continue here, it's important to point out a few things about this clearance. First of all, the Kuusamo airport had at this point switched over from an ATC-controlled airport to a flight information service instead, meaning that the person conducting this service in the tower could no longer issue direct clearances to the aircraft, only give information. As part of the Finnish Aeronautical Information Publication, AIP, which is an official document that all countries have outlining rules for aviation within their airspace, all aircraft departing Flight Information Service airports should turn left after departure if nothing else was reported. But the clearance that Flight 2152 had received would obviously mean a right turn, something that therefore should be reported by the crew. This was a well-established procedure among aircraft that often use this airport, but not so much in the case of this Jet2 crew, which I can kind of understand. If you have a clearance and a plate showing the departure to follow, you wouldn't necessarily think about needing to report which direction that you are going to turn, would you? But this is why it is so important to be aware of local procedures when you operate. Anyway, the first officer soon completed his departure briefing, and in it he also mentioned that since the ramp was completely filled with snow, they should delay extending the flaps until they were about to enter the runway, and that there would be a need to conduct an engine run-up on the runway. So what is that then? Well, an engine run-up on a jet aircraft is done to make sure that there is no ice build-up on the fan blades prior to the start of the takeoff roll. Obviously, it's super important to look for ice on the fan blades during the walk-around, and if that is encountered, either hot air is used to melt it off, or a sponge with hot de-icing fluid can be used to remove the ice by hand. This type of ice can be quite tricky to see since it normally forms on the back side of the fan blades close to the spinner. So when we do the walk-arounds, we always have to use our hands and physically feel the back side of the blades. Now, if we don't find any ice on the fan blades during the walk-around, it can still start to form as we are taxiing out, especially with certain types of precipitation. So if the temperature outside is below 3 degrees Celsius with snow, rain or visible moisture, we typically have to do one of these run-ups. Now, the way that they are done is that the captain normally lines the aircraft up on the runway center line and then, like in this case, hands the controls over to the first officer who is going to be pilot flying. He will then hold the aircraft with the toe brakes and increase the thrust, first up to 40% N1 to allow the engines to accelerate and stabilize at the same level. And once that is done, the thrust is then gradually further increased to 70%, and a timing is started which should, if possible, run for about 30 seconds. This higher engine speed will be enough to remove any ice from the fan blades, and if not, it will show up as higher vibrations on the secondary engine display. But if everything looks normal, which it almost always does, once the 30 seconds are up, the pilot flying can then release the toe brakes, press the toga buttons and call out "Set takeoff thrust." The aircraft will then immediately start to accelerate down the runway, and it's super important that the pilot monitoring, the captain in this case, then properly verifies the correct takeoff thrust is set and then takes over the thrust levers in case a rejected takeoff would be needed. In Jet2, the procedures instructed the first officer to immediately remove his or her hand from the thrust levers as soon as the toga buttons were pushed. And that's worth remembering here. So this was the theory, and it was also what these pilots briefed that they would do. The first officer also mentioned the fact that it was slippery out on the ramp, so there was a possibility that the aircraft might start to skid once 70% N1 was set. And if that would happen, the captain told the first officer that he should just release the brakes and start the takeoff roll immediately. So, all said and done, the pilot soon completed the last part of the checklist as the de-icing crew finished up the de-icing, and once that was all completed, the pilots told the cabin crew to get seated and requested startup clearance from the flight information officer, who immediately approved it. Both engines were then started in sequence, after which the captain started turning the aircraft around and began the very short taxi out to the holding point on taxiway Alpha for runway 12. Now, when it comes to taxiing on the Boeing 737, that's overwhelmingly done by the captain. Now, there are some airlines out there which have a tiller on the right-hand side of the cockpit as well, but in Jet2, the procedure was that the captain should always do the taxiing. In most cases, that didn't really have any impact at all, but it did mean that the first officers were a little bit less familiar with, for example, operating the brakes throughout their entire range. Now, since the taxi out in this case was really short, the crew decided that the first officer should start running through the before takeoff checklist almost immediately, which included selecting flaps 5 among several other things. The flight information officer advised the crew that there was no reported traffic and to advise when they were lined up and ready for departure, which the first officer also read back. Soon the majestic 737-800 was fully lined up, with its landing and turn-off lights illuminating the snow-filled beginning of runway 12, and the captain handed the controls over to the first officer and reported over the radio that they were ready for departure. Now, the FIS officer then responded that the runway was clear. Remember, she was not allowed to give an actual takeoff clearance, and the pilots just read this back. But somewhere in the back of the FIS officer's mind, a slight doubt had now started to build up. She knew what departure clearance the crew had received earlier, but she hadn't heard them reporting which way they intended to turn, which to her was a bit unusual. Out on the runway, the last parts of the before takeoff checklist had now been completed, and the first officer had also stabilized the engines at 40% N1. Now the captain decided that he wanted to see the secondary engine instruments clearly during the run-up, so instead of leaving the lower DU display blank, as we normally do, he had pushed the MFD button to see the instruments fully. This would then mean that he would need to push that same button again twice once the takeoff roll started in order to blank the lower display unit, and he would have to do that at the same time as he started the elapsed time on his clock with his other hand. But this was likely something that he was quite used to doing. Now you might ask, so what was wrong with that? And I would say, well, nothing really, but the lower display is normally left blank because it's programmed to pop up if any exceedances are sensed, so there wasn't really any need to keep it open like this. In any case, he was now waiting with one finger on the MFD button and the other one on the clock as the first officer started moving the thrust levels forward towards 70%. The two CFM56 engines roared more and more, and the whole aircraft started shaking as it always does when we do these run-ups. But in this case, it also now started moving forward and also yawing slightly. It was later shown that this wasn't actually a slide. In fact, the first officer was not pushing the toe brakes hard enough, which enabled the aircraft to start rolling. And since this braking also wasn't completely symmetrical, that also caused that yaw. Now, do you remember what the pilots had briefed that they would do if the aircraft started sliding? Yes. The first officer would then immediately initiate the takeoff roll instead of continuing the run-up. And he had now become quite startled by this sudden forward movement. The first thing he did was to input rudder to counteract the yaw, and that was because he was very conscious about the closeness of the snowbanks on either side of the runway. And as he was doing that, he also called out, "It's sliding!" to which the captain responded, "Let it go." This caused the first officer to immediately let go of the brakes, which then allowed the aircraft to fully start accelerating down the runway. As this was happening, the captain moved his hand over and transmitted a radio message letting everyone know that flight 2152 was now rolling. And here came the next piece of this puzzle. Because remember that doubt that the FIS officer had previously held regarding what direction the aircraft would turn? Well, as the captain now advised that they had started the takeoff roll, she felt obligated to confirm if they were intending to turn right or left, even though she could see that the aircraft was clearly moving. So she just asked, "Chanex 2152, confirm you will be turning right after departure?" Which caused the captain to think for a second and then answer, "Affirm?" After this exchange, he then looked down onto his instruments and he saw that the aircraft had already accelerated past 53 knots. So he now started preparing for his next call, which would be the 80 knot speed cross-check. Meanwhile, the first officer had been concentrating mainly on maintaining the runway centerline, which had taken some effort after that first yaw. So he likely was concentrating most of his attention outside of the aircraft. Now, has anyone noticed anything missing here? Well, during that initial startle, when the aircraft started moving and the captain called, "Let it go," the first officer had done exactly that and just concentrated on steering, but that also meant that he never actually pushed the toga button, nor called out, "Set takeoff thrust." And the captain, whose job it was to verify that the correct thrust had been set, had been interrupted by the FIS officer and had spent those first few seconds of the takeoff roll listening and responding to her calls. Because of that, this initial cross-check was completely omitted and the thrust levels remained at 70% N1, which was the run-up setting. Now, for those of you thinking that the difference between 70% and the correct setting of 89% isn't that big, you have to realize that the amount of thrust delivered by these jet engines is not linear. Instead, it increases almost exponentially as the thrust goes up. So, with only 70% set on both engines, this aircraft was now accelerating with the approximately equal amount of thrust that they would have had with only one engine working. Only 53% of the required takeoff thrust. This meant that the aircraft was obviously accelerating much slower than it normally would, and both pilots apparently felt that something was wrong, but they just couldn't put their fingers on what it was. And the captain thought that, well, maybe it had something to do with the snow contamination on the runway. Now, obviously, there would have been some other clues about what was going on here as well. For one thing, the correct takeoff thrust would have been shown with green indicators on the N1 displays, with 70% being obviously way short of that. But on top of that, since TOGA had never been selected, the flight directors had not been activated, and the flight mode annunciator, the FMA, in front of both pilots would have shown ARM and LNAV in white instead of the N1, LNAV in white and TOGA that it should have shown. But here we come to a few very interesting treats that we humans all share. You see, we are generally very good at remembering procedures and steps to follow, but if for whatever reason one of those steps or procedures are omitted, well, then we are really bad at picking that up. This is why I always teach my students to restart the current procedure from the beginning if they feel that something just isn't feeling right. In most cases, that can be done quite quickly, like in the case of a go-around, for example, and that will allow them to find what steps that they have omitted, if any. Another thing that played a trick with this crew was the acceleration itself. You see, it turns out that another human weakness is judging differences in acceleration rates. As a pilot, we do hundreds of takeoffs every year, but they all differ slightly in acceleration rates, and the way they feel is highly subjective and more based on what we see than what our vestibular organs feel. Because of that, it would have been very hard to pinpoint why the acceleration felt wrong in this case, and therefore also to identify the source of that feeling of unease that these pilots felt. And here is where the industry just must step in and do something. Because while we humans might not be very good at judging these things, computers generally are, and they could therefore easily be programmed to set off a warning if the actual acceleration is significantly slower than usual. And a system like that could work completely independent of outside conditions, performance calculations, and everything else. It just needs to be done. Anyway, the actual acceleration in this case was 2.25 knots per second, which was well outside of what would be considered normal, with the vast majority of takeoffs accelerating with around 4 knots per second. But like I said, the pilots couldn't identify this, and there was no system available to warn them. So this takeoff roll just continued, with the aircraft soon passing 80 knots, which was cross-checked by both pilots, and a few seconds later the aircraft passed 93 knots, and the captain called out, "We won!" followed by another excruciating long wait until the aircraft finally accelerated past 122 knots, where the captain called "rotate." At this point, there was only about 400 meters left of the 2,500 meter long runway, and the aircraft now slowly lifted into the air. The first officer rotated slowly, feeling that the aircraft was very heavy and that it behaved like it was flying on only one engine, but without the yaw that this would normally bring. And he still had no idea of how close this actually was to the truth. After the aircraft got airborne, he initially pitched towards the normal takeoff attitude of around 15 degrees, but long before he reached that, he saw that the speed had stopped accelerating around V2, so he gradually then lowered the nose to around 10 degrees instead, which gave them a climb rate of only around 600 feet per minute. Here, he also looked down onto his primary flight display and realized that he had no vertical guidance, again because the TOGA buttons had never been pushed. The captain now retracted the landing gear, but the aircraft still didn't want to accelerate, and the first officer now called out, "We need more power!" And that finally made the captain look down onto the primary engine display and realize what the issue was. He immediately increased the thrust to 89%, which meant that as the aircraft passed about 250 feet, it now suddenly started climbing normally. The crew continued the departure, and as they passed 2,400 feet, the captain pushed the N1 button, which reduced the thrust back to normal climb thrust, and as they passed 3,900 feet, they started accelerating and retracting the flaps as normal, followed by the selection of level change from the mode control panel, which finally gave them back the vertical flight director. The autopilot was then engaged, and the aircraft continued climbing to their cleared cruise level of flight level 400 towards London Stansted. The rest of the flight was completed without any further hiccups, and they eventually landed safely back at London Stansted Airport. Now, unfortunately, since this flight was longer than 2 hours, the cockpit voice recording of the event was overwritten. But don't worry, new rules are being implemented right now to increase the length of these recorders beyond 2 hours for exactly this reason. The pilots diligently reported what had happened, which led to the final report that I've used for this video. But you might be wondering, why did he tell us all of this when everything ended up well and no one was hurt? Well, this is a great example of why I love making videos about incidents. This occurrence ended up hurting no one, but it forms part of a very serious trend in the industry that could end up in a disaster if nothing is done. We need to come up with better barriers for incidents where the wrong takeoff thrust is being set, either because of mistakes like this or because of incorrectly entered takeoff performance or faulty intersections used for takeoff. Back in 2017, for example, another Boeing 737-800 took off from Belfast with 189 passengers on board, and it ended up lifting off 29 meters after the end of the runway, all because of an incorrect temperature that had been used during the performance setup. In that case, the aircraft ended up taking out an approach light as part of the incident, but again, no one was hurt. But after that, the AAIB started keeping track of similar events, and in the following 5 years, 32 different similar events, including this one, have been recorded. And those are just the ones that have actually been reported. Because of this, the AAIB came with 2 specific safety recommendations that I agree wholeheartedly with. 1. The world's aviation authorities need to work together to develop a set of technical specifications and standards for an onboard system that will alert the crew of an abnormally low acceleration rate during takeoff. We need this now, so whoever you are out there, let's get working on it. And 2. All airlines should implement algorithms in their flight data monitoring programs that can detect precursors relevant to these type of events. That's so that we can more easily track them and see how big this problem actually is. As a direct consequence of this incident, Jet2 included more simulator training around pre-departure run-ups. They updated their crew procedures around this, and they highlighted the need for proper brake application, among other things. Their pilots were also reminded of the need to report which way they were turning after departure when flying in Finnish FIS airports, and the FIS officers in Kuusamo were told how extremely important it was to avoid transmitting anything except really crucial safety information to any aircraft during their takeoff and early climb. Now, as I said, having a dedicated instrument or warning for a too slow acceleration would have been great here. But what happens when pilots get maybe a little bit too reliant on their instruments? Well, as it turns out, we have actually seen that back in 1990. It was a dark, cloudy and rainy evening when a DC-9 from Alitalia started descending over the Alps down towards its destination, Zurich. On board was a very experienced captain, assisted by a relatively new first officer, and where we join this story, he is just finishing his approach briefing for runway 14. But unbeknownst to both him and the captain, something has now happened inside one of their navigational radios, something that will soon have very serious consequences. But at this stage, everything is progressing normally, and the aircraft just continues descending and soon joins into the approach queue together with several other aircraft. But this approach will turn out to be very, very different. Now, when I was working on this video, the hair literally stood up on my arms during certain parts, and you will understand why when I release it in a week or 2. But if you instead want to see it right now, well, then you can go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot or scan this QR code. My Patreons are already previewing it right now, and I would love to hear your feedback as well, because maybe you can help me make it even better. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.